What's the hardest family conversation you've never had?
When my brother stood up in the middle of the dining room and tapped his wine glass with the side of his fork like he was proposing to someone, I already knew what was coming. I had known for weeks, actually, because he'd been dropping not-so-subtle hints in our family group chat about big changes on the horizon and leveling up soon. He loved that kind of theatrical build-up. Always did. Ever since we were kids, Tyler lived for attention, like some people need oxygen. And my mother, God bless her, was only too happy to hand-feed it to him. So when he finally cleared his throat and held up his glass with that smug little grin, the same one he used in high school when he found a way to take credit for one of my science projects, I wasn't surprised. What did surprise me, though, was what happened 5 minutes later. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Everyone, he said, looking around the table with that ridiculous faux humble expression, I just wanted to share some good news with the people I love most. As of next month, I've been offered the director role at Hillstone Financial. It's official. There was this collective inhale around the table. My mom, of course, clapped first. Loudly. Almost too loudly. She looked like she was going to cry. Her hand flew to her chest like someone had just proposed to her. My dad smiled, more muted, nodding like he didn't quite understand what the job meant, but was happy his son was happy. Aunt Marla let out a high-pitched, "Oh my God," and immediately asked about the salary. Classic. And me? I just sat there, still chewing a piece of overcooked roast chicken that suddenly tasted like rubber in my mouth. I didn't say a word. That's when it happened. My mother, still misty-eyed, leaned over and whispered under her breath so no one else could hear, "Please, Rachel. Don't make this about you tonight, okay?" I blinked. I actually blinked like someone had thrown cold water in my face. I wasn't even holding a fork at that point, just frozen, staring at her like she'd slapped me. I hadn't said a damn thing. Hadn't rolled my eyes. Hadn't sighed or scoffed or looked away. I hadn't even looked at my phone. And yet, somehow, in her mind, the possibility of me being offended by Tyler's big moment was enough to warrant a warning in advance. That's the role I've always played in this family, the one who needs to be managed, monitored, cautioned. Because if Tyler is the golden boy, I'm the one who has to be reminded not to dim his shine. Doesn't matter that I've spent the past 15 years building a solid career in the same industry, grinding away in silence, while he bounced from one opportunity to the next like a kid trying on hats. It doesn't matter that I stayed home when our dad had surgery, that I paid half the bills for our parents when their furnace broke and Tyler was between jobs. No one remembered any of that. Because Tyler had just become director. Or so he thought. I was about to swallow my pride and raise my glass anyway, because after years of being told to be the bigger person, I'd practically made it my job, when the doorbell rang. My mom looked confused. No one was expecting anyone else. Tyler frowned too, then smoothed his face back into a polite smile as he went to answer it. What happened next is burned into my memory like a car crash you can't stop replaying in your head. Tyler opened the door, and there stood a man in a dark blazer and khakis, holding a rectangular box with a big, red ribbon wrapped around it. The guy was beaming like this was a surprise party he was thrilled to be part of. "Hey there," the man said. "Sorry to interrupt dinner. I'm Mark, Tyler's manager. Is Rachel here?" It took a second. I didn't say anything. I didn't move. I think I even forgot how to breathe. Tyler's eyes did this little flick toward me, then back to Mark, like he was trying to understand what was happening, like maybe there'd been a mix-up. "Yeah," Tyler said slowly, still holding the door. "She's right there." Mark came inside with the box, set it down on the table like he was presenting a wedding cake, and pulled the ribbon off with a practiced flourish. When he lifted the lid, everyone leaned in. And there it was. White frosting, piped lettering in gold, reading, "Congratulations, new director." Everyone clapped again, half-hearted this time, still caught up in the momentum of celebration, not realizing what had just happened. Then Mark looked directly at me and smiled. "Couldn't let your big day go unnoticed, Rachel. You've more than earned it." The silence that followed was thick enough to choke on. My mom's hands dropped from her face. My dad blinked slowly, like he wasn't sure if he'd heard right. Aunt Marla actually said, "Wait, what?" under her breath. And Tyler looked like someone had just kicked him in the ribs. I watched his mouth open, then close again. Like a fish. Or a liar who just ran out of lies. I didn't smile. I didn't gloat. I just stood up, walked over to the cake, and ran a finger through the edge of the frosting. "Wow," I said, keeping my voice flat. "That's thoughtful." And still, I didn't say a damn word about the fact that I had been offered the same role Tyler thought he had. Or how I had kept it quiet because HR asked for discretion during the restructuring. Or how I knew he had been applying. Or how I'd seen him lie to our parents, claiming they're practically begging me to take the job, when I knew for a fact he hadn't even made the final interview list. Because silence, sometimes, is louder than a scream. And revenge? Well, sometimes it's best served on a sheet cake with buttercream frosting. And no, I hadn't made it about me. But apparently, the universe decided it was about time someone did. There's something grotesquely poetic about watching the spotlight you've been chasing your entire life finally land on you, only to find that it burns a little colder than you expected, like the applause is coming from a distance, muffled, filtered through layers of disbelief and delayed recognition. That night, as I sat at the edge of my childhood bed, which now felt like it belonged to a stranger's forgotten daughter rather than me, I realized that everything I had just done was years, no, decades, in the making. It didn't come from one dinner or one careless whisper from my mother. It was built from the quiet resentment layered like bricks over time, from every birthday where Tyler got what he asked for while I got what was practical, from every compliment aimed at him that somehow carried the unspoken contrast of my own inadequacy. And maybe that's what stings the most, not the favoritism itself, but how shamelessly it was served to me like it was normal, like I should be grateful for crumbs while Tyler was handed a feast. Growing up in a household where being overlooked became so routine that you learned to shrink yourself before someone else did it for you teaches you to develop a certain tolerance for emotional starvation. You learn to celebrate your own wins in silence, to keep your joy quiet because someone else's mood takes priority, and you master the art of preemptively downplaying your achievements just in case they make someone else uncomfortable. I don't think I ever realized just how much of my life I had spent trying not to be a burden until I watched my brother walk into a room like he owned it, again, and saw my mother's face light up like the 4th of July, as if she had just witnessed the second coming. And then, there I was, once again, the footnote to someone else's main event. But what most of them don't know, what none of them know, is that I didn't just get that director role by accident, nor was it handed to me as a consolation prize. I applied for it 4 months earlier, when the posting went internal. I remember the exact moment I hit submit on that application. Sitting in my tiny kitchen at midnight after finishing a 2-hour presentation for a client Tyler had lost 6 months prior due to a mistake I had fixed behind the scenes without ever telling anyone. That night, I poured every ounce of strategy, experience, and edge I had accumulated over the years into a cover letter so sharp it could cut steel. I didn't mention Tyler by name, but I didn't have to. Anyone in that department who had been paying attention knew the real engine behind those quarterly numbers wasn't the man holding the meetings, it was the woman quietly feeding him the data before each call. I didn't tell my family I had applied. Not because I was being secretive, but because, at this point, I had learned the futility of expecting anything beyond a lukewarm, "That's nice, sweetie," from my mother, followed by a quick pivot to whatever dramatic crisis Tyler was dealing with that week. And as for Tyler himself, I knew he was aiming for the same role. I'd seen his calendar filled with mock interviews, overheard him bragging on Zoom to his friends about finally getting what he deserved, and even caught wind of a new wardrobe delivery at his apartment, presumably to dress the part. What he didn't know was that the final shortlist had been made 2 weeks before he even stepped into the last round of interviews, and I had already been on it. What he also didn't know was that, quietly, professionally, and without an ounce of mess, I had outperformed him in every measurable category, and the hiring committee knew it. The rejection email to him, which he apparently never opened or perhaps chose to ignore, had landed in his inbox the same day I got my congratulatory call from HR. I saw it, not because I was snooping, but because he was logged into his Outlook at my place that weekend. He had come over to get advice, claiming he needed my insider knowledge, as he called it. I remember standing behind him in the kitchen, pouring coffee while he pretended to scroll through his unread messages, and I caught a glimpse of the subject line, "Thank you for your interest." I didn't say anything. I just smiled to myself and asked if he wanted sugar. He said no, and that's when I realized he was expecting me to be the sugar, to sweeten his chances, to help him prep, to lift him up one more time like I always had. And maybe that's where something cracked. Maybe that's the exact moment I decided I was done being the scaffolding for his success. I wasn't going to coach him through interviews while sitting on a promotion I had already secured. I wasn't going to dim my own momentum just to keep him from feeling inferior. Because for the first time in a long time, I wasn't inferior. I had won. Quietly. Decisively. Without cheating, without posturing, without the flair or fanfare he relied on like a crutch. And for once, I wanted to see what would happen if I let the truth speak for itself, without buffering it for his ego. So I said nothing. I let him walk into that dinner believing the fantasy he had built. I watched him inflate the lie, watched him soak in our family's applause, watched him claim a crown that was never his to begin with. And yes, I'll admit, there was something petty, something undeniably sharp, about letting him dig his own grave with a silver spoon. But I had been handed so many plastic forks over the years that I figured, this time, I could at least enjoy a slice of justice with a metal one. And the truth is, it wasn't just about the job. It was about reclaiming something that had been stolen from me in pieces over decades, validation, dignity, a damn voice at the table. That dinner wasn't the beginning of my revenge. It was the final act of a plan that had taken shape slowly, patiently, through every ignored phone call, every forgotten birthday, every time my mom cut me off mid-sentence to ask Tyler how his important work was going. It was the sound of a woman deciding that silence wasn't peace, it was oppression in pearls. And if Tyler thought the cake was the only surprise he was getting, he was about to learn something very important. I may have been the shadow all these years, but shadows know how to move in silence, and by the time you see them, it's already too late. If there's one thing I've learned after nearly 20 years in corporate management, it's that people rarely notice the difference between honesty and omission until it's far too late to matter. The trick isn't to lie. Not really, but to allow someone to build their own narrative from whatever pieces you leave out in plain sight. You don't hand them a story. You hand them a few scattered facts, a well-timed shrug, a pause here and there, and they fill in the rest with their own ego, their own assumptions, their own desperate need to be the center of something. And that, in essence, is exactly how Tyler buried himself before he ever stood up at that dining room table to claim a title that was never his. It wasn't malicious, at least not at the beginning. It was surgical, quiet, calculated. A long overdue shift in the balance of power, executed with the same meticulous precision I've used my entire life to stay one step ahead of being dismissed, ignored, or erased. When HR first called to offer me the position of director, their tone was almost apologetic, not because they didn't want me, but because the promotion was coming with a catch. They explained the company was restructuring and that several internal candidates, including some in highly visible positions, were under the false impression they were leading contenders. The board had decided unanimously to go with me, but they were requesting silence until the public announcement date, which was timed with a quarterly leadership summit and media rollout. I remember holding the phone to my ear, watching a pot of water boil over on my stove, and thinking, not for the first time, how strange it is to finally win something you stopped believing you deserved years ago. I said yes, of course. I would have said yes even if they'd told me to wear a disguise and never tell a soul, because I had earned that role the way most women do, by making sure I was twice as prepared, 5 times as consistent, and 10 times as easy to overlook as any of the men applying. I didn't need a spotlight. I needed a seat at the damn table, and this time, they weren't just offering me a seat, they were handing me the keys. But that's when the real idea started to take shape. I could have told my family. I could have told Tyler, even casually, just to be honest, just to clear the air. But I didn't. And not because I wanted to punish anyone, at least not consciously at first, but because for the first time, I had an advantage. A secret. A truth that belonged solely to me. And I realized I could use it, not to hurt anyone directly, but to watch, just watch, what would happen if I stopped cleaning up the emotional messes my brother made every time he overreached. The first moment came 2 weeks after I accepted the offer. Tyler called me in the middle of a workday, something he rarely does unless he needs something. He sounded nervous but excited, asked if we could catch up, and invited me for coffee near his office. I knew what it was about before he even said it. He wanted to talk about the director role. Not because he suspected anything, but because he thought I might know who was hiring, or maybe which board members were pulling the strings behind the scenes. He started by saying he knew someone was gunning for it, and he wasn't worried, but just wanted to make sure the right people were hearing his name. I remember sitting across from him, watching him gesture like a candidate already preparing his acceptance speech, and realizing that he genuinely believed it was his. There was no doubt in his voice. No humility. He thought he had it locked. He asked if I'd heard anything, and I told him, with the straightest face I could manage, that I had been left completely out of the loop. I said something vague about focusing on my own team, and how things had been hectic, and how I wasn't sure what upper leadership was thinking these days. And then, with the kind of precision only older sisters perfect, I smiled and added, "But I'm sure you've got this in the bag. I mean, they love you." He grinned. He actually grinned. Like I had just confirmed what he already believed. And in that moment, I saw the trap snap shut, quiet and clean, no blood, no sound. He didn't question it. He didn't sense the shift in the air. He just assumed, like he always had, that if I wasn't shining, then I must not be in the game. That was his first mistake. And I let him make it with a smile. Over the next few weeks, I kept doing what I always did, my job. I showed up. I worked overtime. I met with departments that weren't technically mine yet. And all the while, I watched Tyler prep for a role he didn't know had already slipped through his fingers. He updated his LinkedIn profile. He sent thank you notes to board members who had already voted against him. He rehearsed mock interviews in the mirror, and when he asked if I'd help him tighten up his talking points, I agreed. Why not? I wasn't lying. I was helping. He didn't ask if I had a conflict of interest, and I didn't offer that information. He assumed. And assumptions are the death of men like Tyler, the ones who build their identities around applause and titles and shiny surfaces. They don't survive quiet storms. They don't notice when the ground shifts beneath them. Not until they're already falling. When the idea of the family dinner came up, a monthly tradition that had become more performative over the years than meaningful, I saw my opportunity. My mother insisted it would be a celebration night, even though no one said what we were celebrating. Tyler hinted that he might have an announcement, and she, of course, clung to that hint like it was gospel. I didn't confirm or deny anything. I simply said I'd be there, and that I'd bring dessert. That's when I made the call to Mark. Mark, my new manager, soon to be my report once the org chart was released, had always been straightforward with me. We weren't close, but we respected each other. I told him, delicately, about the situation. I told him there had been some confusion, and that my family had the wrong idea. I never asked him to come. He offered. He said he didn't want me to feel invisible on what should be a proud moment. He even asked if I liked cake. The box arrived that afternoon, red ribbon, neat white script, and the words that changed everything: "Congratulations, new director." And the truth is, I could have stopped it all. I could have corrected the misunderstanding days before. I could have spared my brother the public humiliation. But the thing about setups is, they only work if you let the other person walk into them on their own. And Tyler didn't just walk. He ran. So when he stood at that table, glass in hand, the room swelling with admiration, I kept my mouth shut. Because sometimes the most devastating truths are the ones you don't have to say out loud. You just let them arrive wrapped in frosting, ribbon, and silence. There are moments in life, rare, exquisite, and almost unbearably fragile, when truth slips through the cracks of pretense and erupts into a space that was never built to hold it. When years of layered silence collapse under their own weight and the resulting rupture is neither violent nor loud, but slow, stretching, unbearable in its clarity. That night, the dining room, with its floral wallpaper and my mother's compulsively rearranged centerpiece, became exactly that kind of pressure chamber. The kind of room where everyone suddenly remembers exactly who they are, not because they choose to, but because there's no longer any place to hide. Mark's voice had barely finished echoing his congratulations when the tension snapped like piano wire, vibrating through the room and slicing into the fragile illusion that had, up until that moment, protected my brother from the consequences of being so fundamentally unaware of anyone other than himself. Tyler's smile, just moments before, gleaming with the certainty of a man enjoying what he believed to be his rightful coronation, twitched, trembled, and then collapsed completely, as if the muscles in his face could no longer support the weight of his own delusion. I stood motionless, watching the dominoes fall behind his eyes, watching him scan the room for some kind of signal that this was a mistake, a prank, a joke engineered by someone jealous or bitter or confused, but no such salvation arrived. No one laughed. No one corrected Mark. No one stepped forward to say, "Oh, he meant to say Tyler, what a mix-up." Instead, what Tyler got was silence, pure, heavy, devastating silence, that confirmed everything before anyone said a single word. My mother's fork clinked against her plate as it slipped from her hand, a soft metallic sound that might as well have been a gunshot. Her face had gone pale, not with shock exactly, but with something more complicated, disbelief braided tightly with a desperate need to understand how she had missed something so crucial, so utterly disorienting. Her lips moved, as if beginning to form the question she didn't want the answer to, but nothing came out, and I could see, in the way her fingers gripped the edge of the tablecloth, that her mind had already arrived at the most dangerous conclusion. This hadn't been a mistake. This had been a choice. Aunt Marla, bless her inappropriate timing and inability to keep quiet in uncomfortable situations, broke the silence first with a breathless, "Wait, I thought Tyler was getting promoted?" Her voice was high and thin, like she was trying to force levity into a room that had forgotten how to breathe. Mark, oblivious to the history crackling beneath the surface, chuckled politely and replied, "Oh, I can see how the confusion happened. Tyler's been a great team player and all, but the board unanimously agreed Rachel was the strongest candidate. She's been leading half the restructuring anyway, she's more than earned it." And with that, it was done. There was no more confusion. No more possibility of salvaging the narrative my brother had spun so recklessly. It was official, delivered by someone whose voice carried the weight of corporate authority, and now it lived outside of our family's twisted power dynamics. The truth was real, permanent, undeniable. Tyler sat down slowly, as though someone had unplugged his limbs from whatever current had been keeping him animated, and for the first time in as long as I could remember, he looked small, not physically, not in stature, but in presence. He was no longer the center of the room. He was an object in it, a spectator. And he hated it. "I didn't even know she applied," he muttered, more to himself than anyone else, though the bitterness curled in his voice like spoiled milk. "Well, maybe if you'd paid more attention to someone other than yourself," I said calmly, unable to resist the release of years of buried venom, "you'd have known a lot of things." That was the moment it all unraveled. My mother, who had remained weirdly still, suddenly snapped her head toward me with a look of betrayal so sharp it almost made me laugh, not because it was funny, but because it was so predictable. "You knew this whole time," she hissed, her voice low and shaking, as though I had robbed her of something sacred, as though it was my fault that she had wrapped her affections so tightly around a fantasy she couldn't bring herself to let go of. "I did," I said. "HR asked for silence. So I stayed silent. Just like you always wanted." She looked like she'd been slapped, but I didn't care anymore. I had spent too many years measuring my words, editing my tone, dimming my own ambition just to keep from being labeled the bitter one, the angry daughter, the jealous sister. That night, I let it all go. Tyler's hands were clenched on the table now, his knuckles white, his jaw flexing in that way it did when he was trying not to explode. I could see the narrative forming in his head. He was the victim, I was the schemer, and this was all a setup designed to humiliate him. His face twisted, and without warning, he spat out the one thing he knew might still hurt me. "You want to talk about lies?" he snapped. Why don't you tell everyone where you were the night Dad had his stroke? Or should I? The air in the room thinned, like someone had sucked it all into a vacuum, and for a second, even I was caught off guard. That was a dirty card to play, one I hadn't thought he'd still be holding, let alone willing to throw down in front of everyone. Go ahead, I said, my voice lower now, heavier. Tell them. And then tell them how I was the only one who paid the damn hospital bills. The only one who stayed up every night for 3 weeks taking care of him while you were on vacation with Madison. He opened his mouth, then closed it. My mother looked between us like she'd just realized she hadn't raised a golden child, but a weapon, one that had finally misfired. Mark, clearly uncomfortable, cleared his throat. Well, I'll let you all get back to dinner. Again, congratulations, Rachel. The company's lucky to have you. He nodded awkwardly, then made his way to the door. The silence that followed was worse than shouting. Worse than crying. Because it was the sound of reality settling in like dust on everything that had once seemed so permanent. I stood, wiped my hands on my napkin, and looked around the table, pausing for just a second on each face. My mother's shock, my father's unreadable mask, Tyler's silent fury, and Aunt Marla's wide-eyed discomfort. I didn't ask for this dinner, I said, my voice cool but not unkind. But thank you all the same. And with that, I turned and walked out, leaving behind the cake, the candles, the broken expectations, and the family that had never once considered the possibility that I might win, even when I'd already won. The night air outside my parents' house was heavy with summer heat, that dense, unmoving kind that clings to your skin and reminds you, whether you want to be reminded or not, that you're standing in a place that never really let you breathe freely to begin with. I walked out the front door without looking back, keys clutched tightly in my palm, not because I was afraid, but because I needed to hold on to something solid, something mine, something that wasn't bound up in other people's versions of who I was supposed to be. The cake, the congratulations, the sharp gasp of realization etched on my brother's face, they were all still sitting at the table behind me, stewing in a silence I had no intention of breaking. I didn't even get into my car right away. I just stood there on the front lawn, staring at the same patch of grass where Tyler once pushed me down during a game of football, and my mom told me not to cry because girls don't play rough. How fitting, I thought. Because that night, I didn't cry either. I played my move and I played it rough, and this time, there was no one left to tell me I was out of line. What people never talk about when they fantasize about revenge, the kind that's layered, slow-burning, poetic in its execution, is that the moment of victory rarely comes with fireworks or overwhelming satisfaction. What comes instead is a strange quietness, a sobering kind of stillness, as though your body realizes it no longer has to brace for impact. And in that vacuum, you start to feel the weight of everything you carried to get there, the years of being overlooked, the small humiliations, the way your accomplishments were always footnotes in someone else's story. The truth is, revenge doesn't heal. It cuts. It just cuts cleaner than the wounds that festered silently for years before it. The next morning, I went to work as if nothing had happened. No one at the office had any idea that the previous night had been the symbolic burial of a family hierarchy that had dictated the course of my entire life. They saw a woman walking through glass doors with quiet confidence, clipboard under one arm, hair pulled back, no makeup, no apology. The public email about my promotion went out mid-morning, and within 2 hours I was getting messages from people I hadn't spoken to in years, people congratulating me, pretending they always knew I'd make it, attaching themselves to my success like barnacles on a ship that finally left the harbor. I responded politely, efficiently. I didn't gloat. I didn't revisit the conversation with Mark. I just did my job, same as I always had, except now the door said director and the meetings didn't start until I walked into the room. Tyler didn't call. Not that day. Not the next. Not the entire week. And my mother, perhaps too ashamed or too furious to decide which emotion she wanted to wear, kept her silence too. It was the first time in years that our family group chat went completely dark, and instead of feeling guilty about it, I felt something else: relief. Relief that, for once, I didn't have to perform. I didn't have to smile at the right moment, laugh at the stories Tyler exaggerated, or swallow my own frustrations like they were pills prescribed to keep the family peace. There was no peace anymore, and in its absence, I found something I hadn't expected: freedom. Still, the silence couldn't last forever, and part of me knew that unfinished business would always circle back. Sure enough, 3 weeks later, I found myself pulling into my parents' driveway again, this time without an invitation, without a cake, and without a single ounce of interest in pretending we were anything close to a happy family. My father had asked me to stop by, just him, and something in his voice over the phone had been quieter than usual, not softer in a warm way, but softer, like someone finally too tired to pretend. He was on the porch when I arrived, sitting in the chair that used to belong to my grandfather, legs crossed, coffee in hand, and the moment I stepped out of the car, he looked up at me like he wasn't sure if I had come to talk or to walk away again. I joined him in silence, letting the breeze, which had returned after weeks of suffocating stillness, carry our awkwardness for a while before he finally broke it with a question so simple and so piercing that I couldn't answer it right away. Was it revenge, or was it just self-respect? And that was the thing. I didn't know. I didn't have a clean answer. I hadn't planned the evening at the dinner table with a checklist of emotional goals to hit or a speech ready to cut through the marrow of my mother's blind loyalty or my brother's ego. It had unfolded like a slow detonation, one that had started years ago, and I had just been standing close enough to the fuse to decide, at the very last second, not to put it out. I didn't tell him all of that. I just stared ahead at the hedge that divided our house from the neighbors and remembered how Tyler used to jump it in one leap when we were kids while I climbed it like an obstacle. Everything with him was a leap. Everything with me was a climb. I think I said eventually, the words cautious, deliberate, that it might have been both. And maybe that's why it worked. He nodded slowly, like he understood more than he let on, or maybe like he didn't want to take sides anymore. And in his silence, I found something close to forgiveness, not for what had happened, but for how long it had taken me to stop needing someone to say, "You were right all along." I left that afternoon without going inside. I didn't speak to my mother. I didn't ask where Tyler was or if he'd called, because it no longer mattered. The balance had shifted. The old rules had been dismantled. And while none of us would ever be the same again, I wasn't mourning the version of myself I'd left behind at that dinner table. She had served her purpose. She had survived. But now it was time for something else. Back in my apartment, I poured myself a glass of wine, not to celebrate, not to forget, but just to sit with the truth of what had changed. And maybe that's the hardest part of all. Not the silence that follows a seismic shift, but the knowledge that, even after the shaking stops, the ground you're standing on is no longer the same, and neither are you. Some people might say I should have handled it differently, that I should have been gracious, that I should have pulled Tyler aside and let him down gently, that family is more important than ego, that a win is only worth it if no one else has to lose. But those people weren't raised in my family. They didn't spend their lives watching someone else be celebrated for your work. They didn't get told, "Don't make this about you," every time they dared to ask for recognition. And they sure as hell didn't get handed a cake, finally, after decades of being told they weren't enough. So if they want to judge me, let them. I didn't make it about me. But when the moment finally came, I didn't step aside either. And that, I think, is the cleanest cut of all.